I am Joshua, 34 years old, and I stood dead center in a banquet hall while 200 people laughed at my medical history projected onto a 10-foot screen. Before I tell you about how I dismantled my family's fake empire with a single text message, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. The word sterile glared in massive, bold white letters right above an old, unflattering picture of my face. The laughter echoing off the crystal chandeliers wasn't the polite, muffled kind you hear at formal events. It was the deep, belly-aching laughter of people who felt entirely comfortable mocking a man because his own flesh and blood had just given them permission to do so. I looked up at the head table. My younger brother, Matthew, the golden child and the groom of the hour, was leaning into the microphone, a smug, satisfied grin plastered across his face. My mother, Patricia, simply crossed her legs, adjusted her designer shawl, and took a slow, deliberate sip of her expensive red wine. She looked like she was watching a mildly entertaining television show. My father, Robert, caught my eye from across the room. He didn't look apologetic. He chuckled, raised his glass a fraction of an inch, and mouthed the words, "Just a joke, son." My jaw tightened so hard my teeth ached. I felt the heat rising in my neck, a flush of pure, unadulterated adrenaline, but I didn't break eye contact. I didn't yell. I didn't flip a table or storm out of the double doors like they probably expected me to. I simply reached into the inside pocket of my custom-tailored jacket, pulled out my phone, and stared at the illuminated screen. To understand why I didn't walk away right then, and why I chose to press send on the single word that would systematically ruin their lives and their reputations in a matter of minutes, you need to understand exactly how we got to that room. It started exactly 4 weeks earlier. It was a Thursday night, barely past 11 o'clock. I was sitting at my drafting table in my apartment in Richmond, Virginia. The city outside my window was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of streetlights. I was nursing a lukewarm cup of black coffee and reviewing complex elevation blueprints for a massive commercial restoration project. My phone buzzed against the solid wood of the desk. The caller ID showed a Virginia area code I hadn't lived in, or wanted to think about, for 16 long years. I picked it up, my eyes still scanning the structural load numbers on my blueprints. A woman's voice, hushed, careful, and distinctly professional, came through the speaker. She introduced herself as Nurse Sarah from the Oak Creek Care Center. My chest tightened immediately. I dropped my pencil. That facility was where my grandfather, Charles, lived. He was 84 years old, sharp as a tack but physically failing, and he was the only person in the entire Linden family who had ever treated me like a human being. Nurse Sarah kept her voice low, as if she was afraid of being overheard. She told me Charles had taken a bad fall in his bathroom earlier that afternoon and was scheduled for an emergency hip replacement surgery the following week. At his age, with his heart condition, the risks were incredibly high. The surgery was not a guaranteed success. My hand gripped the edge of my drafting table until my knuckles turned white. I asked her immediately when visiting hours started so I could drive down and see him. There was a long, uncomfortable, heavy pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint beeping of a heart monitor in the background. She lowered her voice to a near whisper. She told me she was sorry, but my father, Robert, had left strict, legally binding instructions at the front desk. I was explicitly barred from the visitor list. Security had my photograph. The only way Robert would authorize the front desk to let me through those glass doors to see my grandfather, perhaps for the last time, was if I formally agreed to attend Matthew's upcoming wedding. It was a hostage situation, plain and simple. My father was using an 84-year-old man facing a life-threatening surgery as leverage to force me into a family photo op to keep up appearances for his wealthy friends. I closed my eyes and rubbed the bridge of my nose, feeling a massive headache forming. My father never did anything without a calculated, self-serving ulterior motive. A family wedding with the Lindens wasn't a celebration of love. It was a theatrical performance, a business networking event disguised as a reception, and they needed their designated failure of a son in attendance to make the golden child, Matthew, look even brighter by comparison. Before Nurse Sarah hung up, she added one more thing. I heard her take a shaky breath. She said Charles had grabbed her sleeve right before they administered his pain medication. He begged her to pass on a warning to me. He said my parents and Matthew were planning a surprise presentation at the wedding reception. A slideshow. He told her to tell me to be ready, because they were planning to publicly humiliate me. I put the phone down and stared at the dark reflection of myself in the window of my apartment. I hadn't spoken to my parents or my brother in 5 years. I had built a completely new life out of the ashes they left me in. I was a respected architect. I had a thriving career, a beautiful home, a quiet, peaceful life free of their constant manipulation. But as I looked at the framed National Architecture Award hanging on my office wall, I knew I had absolutely no choice. I could not let Charles go into that operating room thinking I had abandoned him. I had to go into the lion's den. To understand the absolute cruelty of that phone call and the weight of my family's hatred, you have to look back 16 years. I was 18 years old, a senior in high school, sitting at the polished mahogany dining table in my parents' sprawling, immaculately decorated suburban home. My father walked into the room, his face set in stone, and slid a thick manila folder across the table toward me. Inside was a legal document to transfer a land deed. When I turned 16, my grandfather Charles did something that absolutely infuriated my father. Charles bypassed Robert entirely and legally gifted me a 2-acre parcel of prime, undeveloped real estate on the edge of town. It was my inheritance, given to me early so I could have a solid financial foundation for my future. I remember the day Charles handed me the papers. We had just come back from a close family friend's funeral, and Charles was in a reflective mood. He looked me dead in the eye and told me never to let Robert get his hands on that dirt. He knew his son's greed better than anyone. Now, at 18, my father was demanding it. He stood over me, his shadow falling across the table. He told me he needed those 2 acres to consolidate property for a massive commercial real estate deal he was putting together, a project he called the Oakdale development. He told me it was my family duty to sign the land over to him. He told me I owed him for the food I ate and the roof over my head. I looked down at the document. Then I looked over at my mother, Patricia. She was sitting at the far end of the long table, flipping through a glossy fashion magazine. She didn't look up. She didn't say a word to defend me. The sound of her turning the heavy, glossy pages filled the tense silence in the room. I took a deep breath, pushed the folder back across the table, looked my father in the eye, and said no. The fallout was immediate, brutal, and entirely merciless. The next morning, I woke up and went to log into my university portal to check my upcoming freshman class schedule. My account was locked due to non-payment. I called the registrar's office in a panic. They informed me that my father had completely drained my college fund overnight. Every single dime he had supposedly saved for my education for 18 years was gone, transferred out into his private business accounts. A week later, I came home from a grueling part-time shift at a local hardware store to find 2 black trash bags sitting on the front porch. Robert stood in the doorway, physically blocking the entrance, his arms crossed over his chest. He looked down at me with absolute disgust. He said if I wasn't going to be a team player and contribute to the family's wealth, I couldn't live under his roof. He told me to pick up my bags, walk away, and never come back. Matthew, who was 13 at the time, stood just behind my father in the foyer. He watched me get thrown out like common garbage. He didn't say a word. He just watched, a faint smirk playing on his lips. I left that night with exactly $43 in my checking account and my entire life shoved into 2 plastic bags. I slept in the back seat of my beat-up, rusting Honda Civic in a sprawling, well-lit Walmart parking lot for 3 straight weeks. I remember the biting cold seeping through the windows, the constant fear of a police officer knocking on the glass, and waking up with my spine aching from the awkward angles. I washed my face and brushed my teeth in gas station bathrooms before the sun came up. I took a brutal job hauling bricks and mixing cement on a construction site by day, and waited tables at a greasy 24-hour diner by night. I didn't just survive those years. I clawed my way up from the absolute bottom. I studied in public libraries until they kicked me out at closing time. I got my GED. I applied for every single need-based grant and academic scholarship available in the state of Virginia, got into a community college, and eventually transferred to a prestigious state university. I worked myself to the bone, sacrificing sleep, a social life, and my physical health, until I walked away with a master's degree in architecture. Nobody from my family came to my graduation ceremony. I walked across that stage entirely alone, holding my diploma, wearing a cap and gown I rented with my own hard-earned money. But the trauma of growing up in that house left deep, invisible scars that I didn't fully understand until later. In my mid-20s, desperate for the family connection I never had, I fell into a relationship with a woman named Jessica. On paper, she was perfect. She was beautiful, educated, and came from a very prominent, wealthy local family. In reality, she was a terrifying mirror image of my mother. My family, who hadn't spoken to me in years, suddenly reached out and, oddly enough, heavily approved of her. They pushed the marriage forward, likely because her family's social standing gave them bragging rights at their country club. The marriage was an absolute disaster from the first month. Jessica demanded complete and total control over my salary. She scrutinized every bank statement, isolated me from the few good friends I had made in college, and constantly belittled my career goals, telling me I wasn't ambitious enough. The final, crushing blow came when we tried to start a family. After a year of failing to conceive, we went to a high-end fertility specialist. The doctor sat us down in a sterile, freezing white room, looked at his clipboard, and delivered the news. The issue was entirely on my end. I was diagnosed with a permanent medical condition that rendered me completely sterile. Having biological children was a biological impossibility. I was devastated. I felt like a failure as a man. But instead of supporting me, instead of holding my hand and telling me we would figure it out, Jessica used my diagnosis as the ultimate weapon. She filed for divorce 3 months later. During the proceedings, she was ruthless. Her lawyer tried to use my medical history to publicly humiliate me in depositions, attempting to paint me as defective to demand a vastly disproportionate financial settlement. She even threatened a vicious custody battle over the golden retriever we had raised from a puppy, just to inflict maximum emotional pain. We fought it out in court for a year, and the financial and emotional drain almost broke me. Somehow, my brother Matthew kept in touch with Jessica after the divorce was finalized. They bonded over their mutual, toxic disdain for me. I knew they occasionally talked, but I never in my darkest nightmares realized they had traded my most painful, private medical secrets for a laugh over drinks. Now, sitting in my apartment in Richmond, looking at the city lights, the pieces finally fell into place. The warning from my grandfather Charles made perfect, sickening sense. They were going to use my deepest pain as their evening entertainment. I agreed to their terms. I called Nurse Sarah back and told her to inform Robert the first would be at the wedding. The very next day, I drove 3 hours south down Interstate 95 back to my hometown for the mandatory pre-wedding family dinner. It was the steep price of admission to get clearance to see my grandfather. I pulled into the driveway of my childhood home, and the overwhelming smell of expensive catered food, fresh floral arrangements, and heavy hypocrisy hit me the second I walked through the front door. Nobody hugged me. Nobody asked how my drive was. My mother, Patricia, looked me up and down with absolute, undisguised disgust. She didn't even say hello. She just walked over to the hall closet, pulled out a plastic garment bag, and shoved it into my chest. Inside was a cheap, ill-fitting, stiff polyester gray suit that smelled faintly of mothballs. She looked me dead in the eye and told me it was what I was required to wear to the wedding, so I wouldn't stick out in my shabby clothes and embarrass them in front of the important guests. We sat down for the formal dinner. The tension was thick enough to cut with a steak knife. Matthew spent the entire meal loudly bragging about his upcoming massive promotion at my father's real estate firm and his incredibly wealthy future in-laws, the Whitmore family. My father, Robert, pointed a heavy silver fork at me from across the long table. He told me the Whitmore family was old money, extremely traditional, highly conservative, and currently holding the keys to the biggest commercial development contract his firm had ever seen in 3 decades. He leaned forward, His eyes narrowed, and explicitly warned me not to speak to anyone unless I was spoken to. Not to mention my messy divorce, and absolutely, under no circumstances, to ruin this business deal. I kept my mouth shut, cutting my chicken in silence, but my mind was racing at 1,000,000 miles an hour. Whitmore. The name echoed in my head like a gunshot. I worked as the lead architect for one of the most prestigious, top-tier design firms in Richmond. For the past 8 months, I had been the head designer and project manager on a multi-million-dollar community revitalization project that was going to completely change the downtown landscape of a nearby city. The private benefactor, the billionaire funding the entire massive endeavor out of her own pocket, was a notoriously demanding, highly influential, and fiercely intelligent woman. Her name was Victoria Whitmore. We had spoken on countless conference calls. We had exchanged dozens of detailed emails regarding structural integrity and aesthetic design, but always strictly professional, and she always communicated with me using my formal firm title and my first initial. She knew me intimately by my work, by my blueprints, by my vision, not by my face. I realized right then, sitting at that dining table, looking at my father's greedy, sweating face, that the billionaire woman funding my massive project was Matthew's future mother-in-law. My father was desperately, pathetically trying to impress the very woman who was currently paying my firm a fortune for my architectural designs. I didn't say a single word. I just chewed my food and let them talk. The next morning, I drove straight back to Richmond and immediately called my best friend, Carter. Carter is a senior IT network engineer, a former military guy, and the most fiercely loyal, brilliantly capable person I have ever met. I laid out the entire miserable situation over the phone. The hostage ultimatum with my grandfather, the cheap polyester suit, the unbelievable Whitmore connection, and the looming threat of the surprise humiliation presentation. Carter didn't even hesitate for a fraction of a second. He told me to give him 20 minutes. He pulled up the country club's wedding vendor list online. He found the specific local audiovisual company that had been hired to run the massive screens, the projectors, and the soundboards for the reception. He made one phone call, presented his massive, intimidating resume, and offered his services as an emergency freelance tech for the weekend event at a fraction of their usual cost. They were understaffed and hired him on the spot. We now had full, unrestricted administrative control of the projection booth. On Thursday, exactly 2 days before the wedding, my father finally called the front desk at the Oak Creek Care Center and authorized them to let me in. I walked down the sterile, fluorescent-lit hallways, my heart pounding in my chest. I walked into my grandfather's room. Charles looked incredibly fragile lying in the stark white hospital bed. His skin pale and thin, but his eyes were as sharp and clear as they had been when I was a kid. I sat in the plastic chair next to his bed, and he gripped my hand with surprising strength. He looked at me, taking in my face, and told me he was so incredibly proud of the man I had become, despite everything they had done to break me. Then his breathing hitched, and with shaking hands, he reached slowly under his mattress pad. He pulled out a faded, yellowed, heavy manila envelope and pressed it firmly into my palm. "I kept the original," Charles whispered, his voice raspy and dry. "Your father has been telling the town, the banks, and his investors that the Oakdale land belongs to him. He's been selling promises and signing preliminary contracts on dirt he doesn't own. He forged a copy years ago to show his partners, but the county clerk rejected it without your signature. This is the original notarized deed. Your name is on it. It's legally yours, Joshua. It always was. Show them." I stared at the thick, official paper in my hands. The implications hit me like a freight train. My father had built his entire current reputation, his credit lines, and his massive upcoming deal with the Whitmores on a complete, absolute lie. He was leveraging prime commercial land he didn't legally possess. I folded the deed carefully, feeling the weight of the paper, and slid it into the inside pocket of my jacket. I wasn't just going to a wedding anymore. I was going to a reckoning. I was ready. Saturday arrived. The sky was a clear, brilliant blue. The wedding day. I pulled my car into the sprawling, manicured lot of the Millbrook Country Club. The driveway was an absurd, sickening parade of extreme wealth. Sweating valets in tight vests were sprinting back and forth, parking cars that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. As I walked toward the entrance, I passed a gleaming black Rolls-Royce, a bright yellow Lamborghini sitting low to the asphalt, a sleek cherry-red Ferrari, and a custom, matte black Porsche. My father and the Whitmores had pulled out all the stops to turn this wedding into a high-society spectacle. I didn't wear the cheap, humiliating polyester suit my mother had shoved at me. I left it hanging in the hotel room closet, right where it belonged. Instead, I wore my own suit, a custom-tailored, deep navy wool suit that fit my shoulders perfectly, paired with a crisp, high thread count white shirt, a subtle silk tie, and polished leather Oxfords. I looked exactly like what I was, a highly successful, confident professional. I walked through the heavy oak doors and into the grand reception hall. It was dripping in cascading white floral arrangements, crystal centerpieces, and warm, golden lighting. I walked over to the elegant seating chart displayed on an easel. My name wasn't anywhere near the family tables. It wasn't even in the middle section with the casual acquaintances. I was assigned to table 14. I looked across the vast room and found it. It was shoved in the absolute, darkest back corner of the room, positioned right next to the swinging, heavy metal doors of the catering kitchen. Every single time a waiter rushed by, the doors would fly open, and I would get hit with the sharp smell of industrial dish soap, roasting meat, and the loud, chaotic clatter of plates and shouting chefs. I was seated with 3 distant, elderly cousins who barely remembered my name and spent the entire time complaining about their arthritis. The extravagant 5-course dinner service began. Up at the front of the room, the head table was an elevated spectacle on a raised platform. Matthew and his new bride, Qley, were holding court, laughing and drinking champagne. Robert and Patricia were glowing, practically vibrating with pride as they mingled with the elite guests. And seated directly next to them, at the table of absolute honor, were the Whitmores. I sat back in my chair and watched Victoria Whitmore. She sat with perfect, rigid posture, eating small bites of her salad, exuding a quiet, terrifying authority. She didn't look overly impressed by my father's constant, fawning attempts to engage her in conversation. Her husband, Richard, a stern-looking, silver-haired businessman, politely nodded along to Robert's non-stop talking, but his eyes were constantly scanning the room, assessing everything. When the champagne flutes were filled for the toasts, Matthew stood up, adjusted his tuxedo jacket, and grabbed the microphone for his groom's speech. He thanked his beautiful bride, staring deeply into her eyes. He thanked his parents for being his absolute rock and providing him with such an amazing life. Then he paused, a malicious glint entering his eye. He looked out across the massive room, his eyes scanning the tables until he finally found me sitting in the shadows of the back corner by the kitchen doors. I also want to take a second to give a quick shout-out to my older brother, Joshua, Matthew said, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art speakers. We really weren't sure he was going to make it today. Actually, to be totally honest with all of you, we weren't sure he'd ever make much of himself at all. But hey, he managed to find a suit that almost fits and he showed up. Let's give him a hand for trying his best. A ripple of awkward, highly uncomfortable, polite applause scattered through the room. A few people at the tables near me physically turned around in their chairs to look at me with blatant pity. My mother, sitting at the head table, covered her mouth with her manicured hand, clearly hiding a delighted smirk. I didn't react. My face was stone. I took a slow sip of my ice water and casually glanced up toward the dark back balcony overlooking the dance floor. There, standing in the shadows of the audiovisual booth, was Carter. He was wearing a black polo shirt with the AV company's logo embroidered on the chest. He caught my eye, his face totally serious, and gave a single, firm nod. The encrypted USB drive we had created was loaded and ready to go. His hand was resting directly over the main system override switch. The storm was finally here, and I was standing perfectly, dangerously still in the dead center of the eye. The lights in the banquet hall dimmed to a soft glow. The DJ's voice boomed over the speakers, announcing that it was time for a very special presentation from the groom's family. A massive 10 by 6 foot projection screen slowly lowered from the ceiling right behind the dance floor. Upbeat, obnoxiously goofy circus-style music started playing through the surround sound system. The screen lit up with photos. But they weren't the standard, heartwarming childhood photos of Matthew and me playing together in the backyard. They were photos of me, specifically chosen and poorly edited to make me look as pathetic as humanly possible. The first slide showed a grainy picture of me at 19, looking utterly exhausted, covered in engine grease and sweat from my shift at the diner, standing next to my beat-up car. The next slide was a picture taken at a family event during my miserable marriage to Jessica. I looked hollowed out and depressed. The text flashed, divorced, broke, alone. The laughter grew significantly louder. It wasn't polite anymore. People at the tables near me were openly turning around, pointing their fingers, and snickering behind their hands. Then came the final slide. A picture of me looking downward, my face cast in shadow, and right across my forehead, the word sterile flashed in massive, inescapable font. The laughter erupted into a full-blown roar. Matthew leaned heavily into the microphone at the head table and said, "Don't laugh too hard, everybody. He might actually cry." My mother swirled her wine, looking thoroughly entertained, completely devoid of maternal instinct. My father gave me that condescending, victorious smile. I took out my phone. The metal felt cold in my hand. I opened my text messages. I had one draft ready, addressed to Carter. I didn't hesitate. I didn't feel an ounce of regret. I hit send. The word was, begin. Instantly, the goofy circus music cut out with a sharp, piercing screech of static that made several guests wince and cover their ears. The massive screen went completely pitch black. "Hey, AV guy, fix the screen," Matthew yelled angrily into the microphone, looking annoyed that his moment of triumph was interrupted. The screen snapped back on, but the font wasn't jagged and red anymore. It was clean, sharp, professional white text on a sleek dark background. The room fell into a dead, confused silence as my face appeared on the screen, but it was a recent, high-resolution professional architectural headshot. I looked confident, sharp, and commanding. The text appeared line by line, crisp and undeniable. "You called me a dropout. Fact. Master's degree in architecture. Graduated top 5% of my class. You called me a failure. Fact. Fully licensed senior architect. You called me broke. Fact. Winner of the National Commercial Design Award. Zero debt. Homeowner." A low, buzzing murmur swept through the 200 guests. The laughter was entirely gone, replaced by shock and confusion. I pushed my chair back from table 14. The wooden legs scraped loudly, violently against the polished hardwood floor. I stood up to my full height. I didn't rush. I didn't run. I walked slowly, deliberately, and with absolute purpose down the long center aisle of the banquet hall, walking straight toward the elevated head table. "What the hell is this?" Robert hissed, his face turning an angry, blotchy shade of purple. He stood up abruptly, pointing a shaking finger toward the dark projection booth on the balcony. "Turn that garbage off right now." "He can't," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room without needing a microphone. "The entire AV system is locked behind an administrative firewall." I stopped exactly 10 feet from the head table. I looked right past my father and locked eyes with Matthew. He looked like a deer in headlights. "You wanted to share facts about my life with your friends, Matthew? Let's share them," I said, my voice ringing out with years of repressed anger finally breaking free. "I survived living in a freezing car for 3 weeks because our father threw me out onto the street for refusing to hand over inheritance land that legally belonged to me. I survived a deeply toxic, financially abusive marriage that you fully supported. And my medical condition is a private, devastating biological tragedy, not a cheap punchline for your pathetic vanity." Patricia stood up, her face pale, her hands trembling. "Joshua, stop this immediately. You are ruining your brother's beautiful wedding. You have always been a disgrace to this family. The only absolute disgrace in this room, I said, my voice turning incredibly cold and steady, is a mother who sits there and drinks expensive wine while her own son's deep medical trauma is mocked on a 10-foot screen for sport. Suddenly, the sharp screech of a heavy wooden chair being pushed back violently echoed from the front VIP table. Victoria Whitmore stood up. She didn't look at my parents. She didn't look at the bride, or the groom, or the hundreds of staring guests. She walked slowly around the edge of the large round table, her designer heels clicking sharply and rhythmically on the wood floor, and she stopped right in front of me. She looked up at the massive screen displaying my professional credentials, then looked back down at my face, studying my features closely. "Joshua?" she asked, her voice carrying a tone of absolute shock, realization, and dawning respect. "Yes, Mrs. Whitmore. Or, as you usually call me on our Thursday morning project alignment calls, J. Linden," I replied calmly, holding her gaze. Victoria turned slowly. The sheer, unadulterated fury radiating from her small frame was palpable. She locked eyes with my father, who was suddenly sweating so profusely his collar was soaked. "Robert," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a dangerously quiet, lethal register that made the entire room hold its breath. "The man you just publicly humiliated in front of 200 people, the man you just viciously called a broke failure and a dropout, is my lead architect. He is the brilliant mind who single-handedly designed the entire downtown revitalization project my foundation is currently funding to the tune of $40 million. The color completely and totally drained from Robert's face. He looked like he was going to pass out. He opened his mouth, but only a pathetic wheezing sound came out. Victoria didn't stop. She took a step closer to the head table. "If this is how you maliciously treat your own flesh and blood, I shudder to think how you treat your business partners behind closed doors. The Oakdale development deal is officially dead. My family, my foundation, and my associates will not do a single cent of business with a man so completely devoid of basic human decency and integrity. This is a moment that changed everything, when I finally regained control of my life. Thank you for your patience in getting this far. You are amazing. Please like the video and leave a comment below to let me know you've been with me. This will not only help more people find this story, but also let me know that my experiences are meaningful to someone. Your support is the biggest motivation for me to continue sharing the rest of this journey." The silence in the grand banquet hall was absolute and terrifying. You could have heard a pin drop on the carpeted sections. 200 prominent people held their collective breath as they watched a local real estate empire completely crumble to dust before the main course of filet mignon was even served. Robert panicked. Pure, primal panic took over. His entire financial future, his heavily leveraged loans, and his social standing hinged entirely on the Whitmore deal going through. He stepped out from behind the safety of the head table, holding his hands up in a desperate, pleading gesture of surrender. "Victoria, please, I beg you, be reasonable," Robert pleaded, his voice cracking, shedding every ounce of the arrogant confidence he had possessed 5 minutes earlier. He sounded utterly pathetic. "This is just a stupid family misunderstanding, a bad joke that went entirely too far. The Oakdale commercial deal is rock solid. The land is secure. We have the city zoning permits. Don't let my estranged son's dramatic, jealous outburst ruin months of careful negotiation and millions in profit." I didn't say a word. I simply reached back into the inside pocket of my navy jacket. My fingers brushed against the thick, folded, slightly frayed paper my grandfather Charles had given me in the Stark hospital room. I pulled it out, unfolded it slowly, and held it up high for the entire room to see. "Are you talking about the central Oakdale land, Dad?" I asked, my voice cutting cleanly through his frantic, sweating panic. I stepped past Victoria and handed the document directly to Richard Whitmore, who had stepped up from the table to stand protectively beside his wife. Richard took the paper, adjusted his reading glasses, and his eyes rapidly scanned the dense legal text and the embossed notary seal at the bottom. "This is the original, legally binding deed to the central 2-acre parcel of the Oakdale development, I said loudly, turning slightly so that the wealthy local investors seated at the nearby tables could hear every single syllable clearly. My grandfather gifted it to me 16 years ago. It has never changed hands. I never signed it over despite the threats. My father has been selling you a massive commercial project built directly on land he does not and has never legally owned. You committed felony fraud, Richard said flatly, his voice echoing off the walls. No, Richard, listen to me. I can explain. It's a complicated family trust issue. I have the overarching rights to develop. Robert stammered wildly, physically backing away until his back hit the edge of the head table, knocking over a crystal champagne flute. It shattered on the floor. We are leaving, Victoria announced. She didn't yell. She didn't have to raise her voice. True power never has to shout. She turned to her daughter, Qley, the bride, who was standing frozen in her expensive white lace dress, tears welling up and spilling over her mascara. Qley, you can stay with this family if you truly wish. But your father and I are done here. Richard handed the deed back to me with a sharp, highly respectful nod. He didn't say a word to me, but the look in his eyes said everything. Then, the Whitmores turned together and walked with purposeful strides out of the banquet hall. The dam broke. The moment the wealthiest, most influential family in the room left in disgust, the illusion of the Linden family's perfection completely shattered. A prominent banker at table 4 stood up, grabbed his wife's expensive coat off the back of her chair, and walked toward the exit without looking back. Then a couple from table 8 stood up. Then an entire table of Robert's local business associates, men who had just been clapping for Matthew, got up and silently, quickly filed out of the room to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout. Patricia fell back heavily into her chair. Her carefully maintained, decades-long facade of composure completely and totally collapsed. She wasn't crying because of what she had cruelly done to her own son. She was sobbing hysterically because her precious social standing was evaporating into thin air right in front of her eyes. You ruined everything, Patricia wailed, pointing a shaking, manicured finger at me, her face streaked with tears. My reputation, our family's name. How could you be so selfish? How could you do this to us? Before I could even formulate an answer, an elderly woman seated at a nearby table stood up. It was Mrs. Higgins, a lifelong, fiercely loyal friend of my grandfather Charles. She calmly picked up her designer clutch from the table, smoothed down her skirt, and looked down at my weeping mother. Patricia, Mrs. Higgins said, her voice dripping with years of unspoken disdain. The only thing ruining your reputation tonight is your own rotten, black core. You reap exactly what you sow. She turned and walked out, her head held high. I looked over at Matthew. He was standing near the massive, untouched multi-tiered wedding cake, totally abandoned. His face was pale, terrified, and small. The golden child finally saw the harsh, unforgiving reality of the parents he had worshipped and the foundation of lies his life was built upon. I didn't ruin this family, I said, looking at Robert, who was staring blankly at the floor, and Patricia, who was sobbing into her hands, one last time. You did. You destroyed it 16 years ago when you chose a piece of dirt over your own son. Do not ever contact me again. I turned my back on them. I walked down the center aisle, out of that banquet hall, the sound of my footsteps echoing through the rapidly emptying, chaotic room. I pushed through the heavy double oak doors and stepped out into the cool, crisp October night air. The parking lot was a mess of headlights as people scrambled to get their cars from the valet. Carter was leaning casually against the hood of my car at the far end of the lot. He had already slipped out the side door of the AV booth before the chaos peaked. He was holding 2 steaming paper cups of cheap gas station coffee. He handed me one as I walked up. He didn't ask if I was okay. He didn't need to. He just clinked his paper cup against mine in the cool night air. Hell of a presentation, man, Carter said, a small, genuine smile breaking across his face. I looked back at the country club, then down at the cup in my hand. I took a slow sip of the bitter, scalding coffee. Tasted better than any champagne I had ever had. Tasted like absolute freedom. The drive back to Richmond that night was the quietest, most peaceful 3 hours of my entire life. Carter drove my car while I leaned my head against the passenger side window, watching the dark outlines of the Virginia trees blur past. We didn't play any music. We didn't need to. The silence wasn't heavy or uncomfortable. It was the sound of a massive, suffocating weight finally being lifted off my chest. For 16 years, I had carried the shame, the guilt, and the false narrative that my family had carefully constructed around me. I had let them convince the world, and sometimes even myself, that I was the broken one. But as the miles stretched on, distancing me from that country club, from my father's desperate face, and from my mother's shattered social facade, I realized something profound. I wasn't broken. I was the only one in that family who was actually whole. You see, small towns like Millbrook have a very specific ecosystem. They run on reputation, appearances, and an incredibly fast, vicious whisper network. When you build your entire life on a foundation of looking down on others, the moment you stumble, those same people will trial over each other to watch you fall. And my family didn't just stumble. I had pushed them off a cliff on a 10-foot high-definition screen. Over the next few weeks, I didn't have to lift a finger or make a single phone call to know exactly what was happening back in my hometown. The gossip flowed like a river, and Carter, who finds an almost terrifying level of enjoyment in monitoring local community Facebook groups, kept me thoroughly updated. The fallout was immediate and absolute. The Monday morning after the wedding, Victoria Whitmore made good on her promise. She didn't just walk away from the Oakdale project. She actively, completely decimated my father's professional credibility. She made a few strategic phone calls to the board of directors at the regional bank that held my father's commercial loans. Once the bank realized that Robert Linden had been securing massive lines of credit using an inheritance deed he did not legally possess, the dominoes began to fall. Two of my father's primary, long-term investors pulled out of his firm entirely within 48 hours, citing a sudden, irreconcilable breach of trust. A major contractor who had been loyal to my father for 15 years sent a polite, legally vetted letter stating he was pursuing other opportunities. My father's firm didn't collapse overnight. He was too deeply entrenched in the town's real estate for that. But the financial bleeding was severe. The massive promotion Matthew had spent the entire rehearsal dinner bragging about, it vanished into thin air. There was no money left to promote anyone. Robert was too busy fighting off a forensic audit to care about his golden child's career trajectory. My mother, Patricia, experienced a different kind of destruction. For her, the social death was far worse than the financial one. For 20 years, she had been the undisputed queen bee of the local country club scene. She hosted the exclusive book clubs, she organized the charity galas, and she dictated who was in and who was out. But the Whitmores were the apex predators of that social food chain. When Victoria Whitmore publicly humiliated Patricia and walked out of that reception, it was a social execution. The week following the wedding, Patricia received a brief, painfully formal email from the Millbrook Autumn Gala Planning Committee. They informed her that they were restructuring the leadership board and would no longer require her services. No phone call, no apologies, just a polite dismissal. Carter told me that Patricia had tried to call 3 different women from her inner circle to complain about the unfairness of it all. None of them picked up the phone. They didn't return her voicemails. The book club she had hosted in our living room every third Thursday for a decade quietly relocated to another woman's house. Nobody bothered to send Patricia the new address. She was a ghost in the very town she thought she ruled. Then there was Matthew. The marriage that was supposed to cement the Linden family into the upper echelon of society didn't even survive the honeymoon phase. I heard through the grapevine that Qley, the bride, had packed 2 large suitcases and moved into her parents' massive guest house less than 2 weeks after the disastrous reception. She didn't file for divorce immediately, but she demanded total separation. She told Matthew she could not, and would not, tie her life to a family capable of such breathtaking cruelty. She realized that if they could do that to their own blood, they would eventually do it to her. Matthew was left entirely alone in the overpriced townhouse my father had bought them as a wedding gift. I didn't reach out to any of them. I went back to my firm in Richmond. I put my head down, fired up my drafting software, and threw myself entirely into the final design phases of the downtown heritage restoration project. I was at total peace. 3 weeks after the wedding, on a rainy Tuesday evening, my phone rang. I was sitting at my kitchen island, eating a quiet dinner and reviewing some material costs. I glanced at the screen. It was Robert. A year ago, seeing his name on my phone would have sent my heart rate through the roof. I would have braced myself for an attack, for guilt trips, for the overwhelming anxiety of not being good enough. Now I felt absolutely nothing. My pulse remained perfectly steady. I let it ring 3 times, took a sip of water, and hit accept. "Joshua," Robert said. His voice didn't have the booming, arrogant authority it usually carried. It sounded thin, strained, and exhausted. "Robert," I replied, keeping my voice entirely flat and professional. He didn't start with an apology. Men like my father do not know how to apologize because that would require acknowledging they did something wrong. Instead, he started with a business transaction. "I have my lawyer drafting up some paperwork," Robert said, clearing his throat. "We need to handle this Oakdale land situation. It's becoming a massive headache for the firm's portfolio. I'm willing to offer you a very generous buyout. Above market value. Name your price, Joshua. Let's end this ridiculous feud like adults and get this paperwork signed." I leaned back in my chair and looked at the rain hitting the kitchen window. He still thought he could buy his way out of his own consequences. "The land isn't for sale," I said simply. "Don't be stupid," Robert snapped, a flash of his old temper bleeding through. "You don't even live in Millbrook. You have no use for 2 acres of commercial dirt. I have investors threatening to sue me for misrepresentation. I need that deed consolidated into the firm's holdings by Friday. Tell me what number you want to see on the check." "I think you misunderstood me, Robert," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, icy level. "It is not a matter of price. That land was my inheritance from a man who actually loved me. You tried to steal it when I was 18. You threw me out into the street with nothing because I wouldn't hand it over to you. And now, 16 years later, you want me to save you from your own greed? The answer is no. The land stays in my name. I might build a house on it. I might turn it into a community park. I might just let the grass grow wild for the next 50 years. But you will never, ever build your legacy on it." There was a long, heavy silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his ragged breathing. "You are destroying this family over a piece of dirt," Robert hissed, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and sheer panic. "You destroyed this family 16 years ago," I corrected him. "You just finally got the bill for it. Do not call this number again." I hung up. I didn't block his number. I wanted him to have the freedom to call and the absolute certainty that I would never answer him again. I put my phone face down on the granite counter and finished my dinner. Tasted fantastic. 2 weeks later, the final, most surprising piece of the puzzle fell into place. It was a Saturday night. I was on my couch, reading a book on sustainable urban architecture, when my phone vibrated. I looked at the screen. It was Matthew. It was past midnight. I almost ignored it, assuming it was an angry, defensive rant. But something told me to pick it up. "Hello," I said. "Josh." Matthew's voice was slurred, thick, and heavy. The background was completely silent. He wasn't at a bar. He was sitting alone somewhere. I could hear the faint clink of ice against glass. He was heavily intoxicated. "What do you want, Matthew?" I asked, keeping my guard up. "She's not coming back," Matthew said, his voice breaking. "Qley. Her lawyer sent over the formal separation papers today. She's completely done with me. The firm is a disaster. Dad is screaming at the partners every day. Mom won't leave her bedroom. She just sits in there with the blinds drawn, crying because the country club ladies blocked her on Facebook. I didn't say anything. I just listened to the wreckage of the golden child. The slideshow was so wrong, Matthew whispered, letting out a shaky, pathetic exhale. I know it was wrong. I knew it when we were making it. Mom picked out the ugliest photos. Dad wrote the jokes. I put the graphics together. We sat in the living room laughing about it. We thought we were so untouchable. Why did you do it? I asked. I didn't ask out of anger. I asked out of genuine clinical curiosity. I wanted to understand the mechanics of their cruelty. Matthew took a long, shuddering breath. Because I was terrified of you, he admitted, the alcohol stripping away his usual arrogant defenses. My whole life, Dad told me I was the successful one. He told me I was the smart one, the one who did things right, the one who stayed and followed the rules. He gave me the job, he gave me the down payment for the house, he arranged the introductions to the Whitmores. He handed me my entire life on a silver platter. He paused, and I heard him take another swallow of his drink. But then I would look at you, Matthew continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, raw whisper. You had nothing. We literally stripped you down to nothing. We threw you out in the trash. And you built this incredible, massive life anyway. You got the degrees. You won the awards. You got the respect of people like Victoria Whitmore. You did it entirely by yourself. You didn't owe Dad anything. You were completely free. The truth hung in the air between us. It was profound and tragic. I realized something at the wedding, Josh, when you were standing there looking at us, Matthew said, crying softly now. I'm just a puppet. I'm a 30-year-old man, and I have never made a single real decision in my entire life. Dad pulls the strings, Mom polishes the strings, and I just dance. I made fun of you for being alone, but I'm the one who is completely empty. I have nothing that is actually mine. It was the most honest, vulnerable thing my younger brother had ever said to me in his entire life. I could have been cruel in that moment. I could have listed every single time he twisted the knife. Every holiday I spent eating cheap diner food alone while he opened extravagant gifts. Every lie he helped spread about my divorce. But cruelty was their language, not mine. I had already won. I didn't need to kick a man who had already tied his own noose. You're right, Matthew, I said quietly. You don't have anything that is yours. But you can start. How? He sobbed. My life is over. Your fake life is over. I corrected him. Without me around to be the family punching bag, you guys finally have to look at yourselves in the mirror. It's ugly, but it's reality. I can't fix your life, Matthew. I won't ever be your best friend. Too much has happened. But you can start by getting professional help. Go find a therapist. A real one. Not someone Mom recommends. Someone who will sit in a room with you and force you to look at the incredibly toxic programming you were raised with. There was a long silence. Do you think I can change? He asked, sounding exactly like the frightened 13-year-old boy who stood in the foyer and watched me get thrown out. I think everyone has a choice, I said. I made mine 16 years ago. It's time you make yours. I didn't say goodbye. I just gently ended the call. I set the phone down on the table and looked out at the Richmond skyline. The city lights were bright and steady. I felt a deep, profound sense of closure. The war was officially over. I had dismantled the false idols of my family, not with anger, but with undeniable facts. Now it was time to build. Part 8. Epilogue. The following Saturday morning, I woke up early. I didn't have to navigate any ultimatums or jump through any toxic hoops. I just got in my car, bought a hot black coffee, and drove to the Oak Creek Care Center. Nurse Sarah greeted me at the front desk with a massive, warm smile. She didn't have to check any restricted visitor lists. She just pointed down the hallway toward the sunroom. My grandfather Charles was sitting in a comfortable armchair near the large glass windows. A crocheted blanket draped over his lap. His hip surgery had been a complete success. The physical therapy was grueling, but he was stubborn, and he was fighting his way back to mobility. When he saw me walk into the sunroom, his entire face lit up. It wasn't the fake, polished smile my parents used. It was real, deep, and filled with absolute joy. I pulled up a chair next to him and grabbed his hand. His grip was still remarkably strong. "I heard you caused quite a bit of trouble at the country club, my boy," Charles said, his eyes twinkling with pure mischief. "I just gave a presentation, Grandpa." I smiled. "They provided the projector. I just provided the facts." Nurse Sarah walked over with a tablet computer in her hands. She was grinning from ear to ear. "Charles has been making me show him this video every single morning after his physical therapy," she said, handing me the tablet. I looked at the screen. Someone, likely a younger cousin or a date of one of the guests, had pulled out their phone and recorded the entire confrontation at the wedding. The video had been quietly passed around the extended family chat groups. I watched myself on the small screen, standing tall in my navy suit, pulling the inheritance deed out of my jacket pocket and handing it to Richard Whitmore. I watched Victoria Whitmore absolutely eviscerate my father. Charles leaned over, tapped the screen with his weathered finger, and let out a loud, booming laugh. "Look at Robert's face." Charles chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. "He looks like he swallowed a lemon whole. I told you, Joshua. I told you to never let him get his hands on that land. You stood up to him. You stood up to all of them in front of the whole damn town. That's my boy. That is exactly the man I knew you would become." We sat in that sunroom for 3 hours. We didn't talk about the wedding anymore. We talked about architecture. I pulled out my laptop and showed him the 3D rendered models of the Downtown Heritage Project. I showed him how I was preserving the historic brick facades while integrating modern, sustainable glass structures. He listened to every single word, asking incredibly sharp questions about load-bearing walls and material sourcing. For the first time in my life, I felt like I truly had a family. For months later, the season changed from autumn to a crisp, bright winter. I stood in the men's restroom of the Millbrook City Hall, adjusting the silk tie of my custom suit in the mirror. Today was the day. Today was the final, official presentation of the Oakdale Downtown Revitalization Project to the City Council and the primary investors. I walked out of the restroom and pushed open the heavy double oak doors of the council chambers. The room was packed. Sitting in the front row were the members of the city council, the mayor, and several prominent local business leaders. I recognized at least a dozen faces in that room. They were the exact same people who had been sitting at the banquet tables at Matthew's wedding. They were the people who had initially laughed when my face flashed on the screen with the word failure. But today there was no laughter. Today there were no jokes. I walked up to the podium. Victoria Whitmore was sitting in the front row, holding a sleek leather portfolio. She looked up at me and gave a single, highly respectful nod of approval. I turned on the massive digital display behind me. I didn't need notes. I knew every square inch of this design. I spoke for 45 minutes, detailing the structural enhancements, the community spaces, the economic impact, and the aesthetic integration of the historic properties. I commanded the room with absolute authority. When I looked out into the audience, those same businessmen who had watched my father crumble were now nodding vigorously, taking furious notes, and looking at me with undisguised awe and respect. When I finished the presentation, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't polite, golf clap applause. It was genuine, enthusiastic recognition of a masterclass in architectural design. The mayor stood up and publicly thanked me for bringing such an incredible vision to their town. After the meeting, I walked out the front doors of City Hall. The cold winter air hit my face, sharp and clean. I stood at the top of the concrete steps and looked out over the town of Millbrook. The town that had whispered about me. The town where my father had tried to erase my existence. The town where I had been thrown out with garbage bags. I wasn't the town's disgrace anymore. I was the architect rebuilding its future. My 2 acres of land, the inheritance from my grandfather, remained entirely untouched on the edge of town. Sat there, quiet and peaceful. Maybe one day I will build a sprawling, beautiful house on it. Maybe I will build a small, quiet cabin where my grandfather can sit on the porch and watch the creek. Or maybe I will just leave it exactly as it is, a permanent, undeniable monument to the fact that some things, and some people, can never be bought, bullied, or stolen. They called me sterile, divorced, a failure, a dropout, broke, and alone. I am a few of those things. I am divorced. I am sterile. But those medical and legal realities do not define my worth as a man. They are simply chapters in a much larger, much more successful book. I am not broke. I am not a failure. And I am certainly not alone. I have my best friend. I have my grandfather, and most importantly, I finally have profound, unshakable respect for myself. You do not need your family's permission to have a life worth living. You do not need to sit at their table if they are serving you poison. You just need to stop asking for a seat, stand up, and build your own damn house. That is my story. And if you have stayed with me until the very end of this video, I want to take a moment to speak directly to you. We are often programmed by society to believe that family is an unbreakable bond, that blood dictates loyalty no matter how toxic the environment becomes. But the greatest lesson I learned from surviving the Linden family is that respect is the absolute baseline for any relationship, blood or otherwise. If someone requires you to shrink yourself, to hide your truth, or to endure humiliation just to earn their love, that is not love. That is control. Setting boundaries is not an act of cruelty. It is an act of extreme self-preservation. You cannot heal in the same environment that broke you. Walking away from the people who share your DNA might be the hardest thing you ever do, but it is also the key to unlocking the life you actually deserve. You have the power to redefine what family means to you, and it starts by protecting your own peace. I want to know what you think. What was the most important takeaway from this story for you? Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family dynamic to save yourself? Please share your thoughts in the comments below, or if you simply agree that setting hard boundaries is necessary for a peaceful life, just comment the word good down below. It helps the channel, and it lets me know this message resonated with you. Thank you for listening, and remember to protect your peace.